E ngā mana, e ngā iwi, ka huri ngā mihi kia koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Hello everyone, my name is Andy Blair. Welcome to this Pivot 2020 session, Geothermal Project Development, Considerations from the Trenches. It's great to have you all here. We're looking forward to a great discussion today. Firstly, who am I, apart from a person with a strange accent? My name's Andy Blair and I'm the director of a global geothermal science and engineering research and consultancy organisation based out of New Zealand. And if you didn't understand what I said originally, I welcomed you all in Māori, which is the Indigenous language of the peoples of New Zealand. I am also the president of the International Geothermal Association and a board member of the Geothermal Resources Council in the US. So firstly today, I'd like to introduce you all to the great panel that we have here. Firstly, we are going to have Kate Young, who's the Geothermal Program Manager for the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Paul Thompson, the Vice President of Business Development for the Americas from Ormat Technologies. Tim Latimer, co-founder of Fervo Energy. Doug Hollett, President for Melroy Hollett Technology Partners. Caitlin Allen, President and CEO of Global Affairs Associates. And Monica Padilla, Director of Power Resources, Silicon Valley Clean Energy. So first off, what is our panel about today? And we're going to be talking today about the fact that there are more obstacles in geothermal energy development than there are for oil and gas in some parts of the world, including the US. And why is that? So this panel will explore the current regulatory, policy and permitting framework for developing geothermal projects. We'll have particular focus on the US, including the consideration of PPAs and utility engagements, project economics and finance, those important elements. So here on the panel, we have experts from both startups and large developers, and we'll examine the hurdles in the project development process and provide insight into what newcomers might expect in geothermal project development. And first of all, I'd like to invite our panelists to introduce themselves to us. So I'd like to introduce Kate Young. Welcome to the panel.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I'm delighted to be here. My name is Kate Young. As Andy has said, I'm the Geothermal Program Manager at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. I have a background in geological engineering and geochemistry, but I've been at NREL for the last 12 years, and some of the research that we focused on has been techno-economic analyses of geothermal development, as well as the current and proposed regulations and policies and how those have an impact on the techno-economics of projects. So I'm delighted to talk with you today, and I look forward to our discussion.
Great, thanks, Kate. And now Paul Thompson.
Hello, Andy, and everyone out there. Thank you for having me. My name is Paul Thompson, and I'm the Vice President of Business Development for Ormat Technologies. We've developed just under 1 gigawatt of geothermal generation in the United States. We're actively developing hundreds of megawatts to fill the needs of the utilities on the West Coast, and all of those looking to get more renewable energy into their grid. And so it's a very exciting time. I'm thrilled to be on this panel and discuss those issues. I also have the honor of serving as chairman of the Geothermal Resource Council Policy Committee. So we try to talk to our legislators and keep them involved, and I'm happy to discuss the efforts to streamline permitting, create a more favorable tax environment, all of which will lead to more geothermal development into the near future.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Paul. And now over to Tim.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Tim Latimer, I'm the co-founder of Fervo Energy. My background is actually in drilling engineering. I worked in the oil and gas industry for many years before I decided I wanted to make a career pivot of my own and focus on geothermal, which I found to be quite an exciting and dynamic field. At Fervo Energy, we are a geothermal developer that uses new technology, specifically horizontal drilling and distributed fiber optic sensing, to increase the performance and the reliability and the cost effectiveness of geothermal. And we're active mostly in the Western US with a series of projects and also starting to look internationally. So would love to speak about that as well. Fervo has been around for about 3 years. We're fortunate to be spun out of Stanford, out of technology we developed for increasing reservoir performance, and been supported by the Geothermal Technology Office at the Department of Energy, as well as RPE, and backed in the private sector by Breakthrough Energy Ventures, which is a $1 billion clean energy VC fund that's set up to address technologies that could really make a big impact on climate change. So it's been exciting for us to see all across the ecosystem, the public sector, the private sector, a lot of enthusiasm and support for geothermal, and I'm really excited to dig into the topics today on how we can accelerate that even faster.
Great, thanks, Tim. And now over to you, Doug.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, my name is Doug Hollett. I'm a geologist and technologist by background. I spent about 29 years in the oil and gas sector, involved in international exploration and, importantly, starting major shale plays in the United States. And then I came to DOE a number of years ago, and first in the Geothermal Technologies Office, where I was really keen to be able to bring oil and gas practices and technologies and apply them into geothermal. I was responsible for initiating the Forge initiative, the Play Fairway work, and a number of other initiatives, and then moved into renewable power. And I was a deputy assistant secretary for renewable power for DOE for a couple of years. I now consult on a variety of technology and policy issues, both for small startups. I advise Tim Latimer at Fervo, a company called Smart UQ, which does uncertainty quantification. And I also work currently with a number of universities and national labs.
Great, thanks, Doug. And now, Caitlin.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm Caitlin Allen. I'm president and CEO of Global Affairs Associates. We're a boutique ESG and sustainability consulting firm based in Houston. We, as consultants, you might be wondering, why is a consultant on this panel, right? But most of our clients are in the oil and gas sector or B2B manufacturing, a lot of the support system for energy. And so we have clients that have participated in geothermal projects, and a lot of colleagues, because we focus a lot on those sectors. We also work on energy transition strategies. So this is obviously a very important topic to a lot of our clients. And I'm just grateful to be here today and share some of those insights with you guys.
Thanks, Caitlin. And Monica.
Good morning from California. So I'm Monica Padilla, Director of Power Resources for Silicon Valley Clean Energy. SVCE is a new breed of buyers. We're a community choice aggregator, which is basically a public entity that is allowed to serve a community with all their generation needs. Prior to joining SVCE, I spent over 30 years at a small municipal utility in California. My functions and roles have pretty much been around procurement and portfolio management. Since starting SVCE in 2017, so a relatively newcomer to the buying market, SVCE has invested more than $1 billion in renewable resources, including 2 geothermal contracts that we signed in 2019. We have a long way to go to meet our carbon-free and RPS, or renewable procurement standard requirements, and we hope geothermal becomes a part of that in the future as well.
Great, thanks, Monica. So you can all see that we've got a really interesting group of people with a variety of backgrounds, and I'm sure we've gained lots of really interesting insights. So to kick off the conversation, I'm going to ask the panel a few questions and invite the panel to answer. And after that, we're going to ask the audience to send in some questions. So first of all, to start with our questions, with regards to the regulatory process for geothermal projects as compared to other energy sources, what are the key differences and challenges? Doug, would you like to kick off? with an answer there?
I'd love to. I'd love to. And this is a topic that has come up in other sessions in the past couple of days. And it's also a topic that Kate Young has done a tremendous amount of work on. And so I look forward to her thoughts and comments on this as well. Most of the geothermal resources in the U.S. Are on public lands in the West, and that sort of underpins part of the challenge. You end up with long regulatory timelines, and as well, and this is important, the lack of some of the streamlining or optimization opportunities that are afforded to other energy sources, both other renewables and oil and gas. And one of the good examples of that would be the lack of categorical exclusions for certain low impact activities that geothermal does, that as well as oil and gas has the CXs, or the categorical exclusions. Geothermal does not have that benefit. And so the opportunity for me, thinking about what do you do about it, is to organize around the problem. It requires, we've been talking about it for quite a while, but the opportunity now would be to actually get multiple entities and agencies and industry to organize around actually fixing this collectively, rather than sort of chipping away at it one small piece at a time.
Great, thanks, Doug. Kate, I'm going to ask you to chime in there as well.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And so, as Doug said, categorical exclusions are a big component, and some of the work that NREL has done has been to look at the impact that these, the lack of a categorical exclusion, or the lack of these, the presence of these long timelines has on project development. And it can, and the work that we did is published in the DOE's GeoVision study, but it showed that it can, that addressing these timelines and helping to improve these timelines can more than double geothermal deployment by 2020, even if we just stay with the status quo hydrothermal. And so it's a really, really important piece of project development. But one of the things to keep in mind, a lot of the panelists that we've been hearing from over the last couple of days have talked about a different kind of geothermal, a kind of geothermal that can be developed anywhere throughout the United States, anywhere throughout the world. And when this starts to happen, we also need to look at regulatory processes in these other states that haven't traditionally had geothermal. And so making sure that they have processes for getting permits, processes for getting access to wells, access to land, leases, and things like that. I think that's going to be a really important component as we start to see geothermal shift the paradigm of what it looks like from today.
Great, thanks, Kate. I'm going to ask you this question, Caitlin. We know that there are current investment trends focused on environmental, social, governance and the energy transition, and there's a new focus on those sort of investments. So how does the existing regulatory framework support or hinder that kind of investment strategy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's no secret, of course, that financial markets often move faster than regulations and policy, but sometimes the regulations and policy can hinder that movement, right? So in the case of the United States, we've been really playing catch up as the rest of the world, and in this case, the rest of the world meaning globalized financial markets, move toward the goals of the Paris Agreement, actively work toward a more diverse energy mix and a low carbon economy. So the current emphasis on ESG, as you mentioned, environmental, social governance, ESG, and energy transition by the financial community should be seen as market signals. And so what we really need in the US are regulations and policies that follow those market signals and allow us to capture some of that estimated $26 trillion to be made on this transition to a low carbon economy. And I can give a specific example since this is from the trenches. I spoke to several colleagues of trying to get some really nitty-gritty examples for you. So I'll give you one for now. And that's the difficulty that we can have in getting new energy technologies, and particularly new applications of old technologies, getting them permanent classes. So a colleague of mine, Omar Abu Sayed, of Geoenvironment Technologies in California, has been operating biowaste injection wells that use geothermal heat to basically create an underground anaerobic digester at a fraction of the cost of and of the emissions of building one at the surface. So Geoenvironment Technologies has been operating safely for 10 years, and they're still classified as an experimental technology by the EPA. So that's the class 5 experimental wells. So in order to get a permanent class, the EPA wants to see more projects, right? But it's difficult to raise the money to do that because you have an indefinite project life as an experimental with the experimental classification, but it's perceived by the market as short term. So that causes a bit of a chicken and the egg issue. Right, so it's hard to raise the money to get more if there's not a clear path to a permanent class. So I'll pause on that and let you continue for now.
Thanks, Caitlin. Brace yourself, Paul. I'm about to ask you a question. Project economics. What do you consider are the key challenges as compared to other energy options?
Well, thank you again, Andy, and I hope you can all hear me. I want to take a step back just to the categorical exclusion conversation for a second and the financing question. And I think to kind of put it in layman's terms, what's so critical about that discussion is geothermal needs to go out and explore and find these geothermal resources. And if we have to go through a full environmental impact statement or environmental assessment before we can prove that there's a resource, financing those projects is very difficult. And so I think it's critical that and there is legislation pending in front of Congress to expedite this for this exploration component so that all the people listening on the phone can, if they're starting up their geothermal company, can go out and explore, find the resource, then take that to the entrepreneurs, the financiers, the angel investors, prove that they've got a resource so they can use that financing to develop the geothermal projects. Today, that doesn't exist, and that really slows development unless you've got deep pocketbooks that can allow you to pay for that investment, without any outside help. So that's critical for that, first discussion. I think, what is so exciting about geothermal today is that we are starting to realize that the geothermal attributes are incredibly valuable. And for those of you who have known the Geothermal Energy Association or many of the people on this call, we've been discussing this for years, if not decades. And what we're finally seeing, especially in California, is this idea that energy has a value, capacity has a value, and that capacity value is increasing. And that's the idea that as they delve deeper into higher renewable penetration, they need a resource that has no emissions, that's flexible, that can be there when the sun isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining. And that's geothermal. And so what we are starting to see is people realize that 1 geothermal megawatt is equivalent to 3 or 4 megawatts of solar with storage. Now, when you start talking about pricing, you really start to compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges, meaning if you see a 2-cent solar and storage project and multiply that by 4, you get to 8 cents per kilowatt hour or $80 a megawatt hour. And geothermal contracts are coming in somewhere between 6 cents and 7 cents or $60 to $70 a megawatt hour. So it's not a shock to me that we are seeing utilities like Monica's and others, who are forward thinking, who, can delve into these economics, signing up geothermal at a record pace. And that's why at the beginning of 2020, despite all that's going on, we've seen more PPAs signed this year than we've seen in the last probably 10.
Great, thanks, Paul. That's some great insights there. And Tim, we might throw to you to add some more commentary on that.
Yeah, definitely. I just want to build on those comments, and especially thinking about what Caitlin talked about the market oftentimes leading the regulation and policy and how important that is. And I think I love the subtitle of this talk, kicking off the geothermal decade, because I think it is truly a turning point here. And we're seeing market traction in a way that we really haven't in the US in a long time. And that's really meaningful. And the private sector by signing all these PPAs that Paul just talked about, is sending a signal to the regulatory bodies and the policymakers that this needs to be a priority now, and they're going to start following. You know, in terms of fixing some of the policies and regulations around this, one thing that's been frustrating for me as an entrant into geothermal from oil and gas is that groups like Kate Young's group have actually identified exactly what policies need to be fixed, but there's not been the demand and drive to put that into place. And I think that that's changing now because there's so much market traction. There's actually an incentive to do that with all these new PPAs. And I'll just talk about this. It's in a lot of ways, it's not a question of policy, it's a question of resources. And I've been astounded as I've entered this industry, coming from the oil and gas space, where we have very responsive regulators that work with us to tell us what to do and where to do it. And we were able to get projects permitted very quickly in that regard. Whereas a common experience for me in geothermal is we submit all of the necessary paperwork, regulations, environmental impact assessments to the regulatory bodies, and it sits there for months and months and months, and we actually can't even get a response. And when you ping them about it, they say, we don't have the resources. And so the same office that has many resources dedicated to oil and gas to do these reviews doesn't have it for geothermal. And for many years, I think that a lot of people were fine living with that status quo. But now there's so much demand from the private sector and investors to do renewable energy and clean energy that I don't think we can stand anymore for these regulatory bodies slow playing a clean, fuel secure energy resource that has tremendous value to the market. And I'm starting to see that change. You're getting attention across the regulatory bodies and the policymakers to do this, and it's because there's a market signal there. And we need to be more vocal as our industry to say, look, this prize is huge. As the GeoVision study that Kate outlined said, I mean, it's 60 gigawatts or more that we could bring online very rapidly to be that part of the energy mix that is clean, that provides capacity value, that does this. But if we don't actually allow the resources needed to review these projects and get through to happen, it's never going to happen. In many cases, it's not a question of changing policy. It's a question of actually having these offices review these and put the resources to them that they do for fossil fuel resources. And you just don't see that parity today, and that needs to change pretty quickly. And I'm very optimistic it is, because there are so many people in the marketplace now demanding that change.
Great, thanks, Tim. Kate, I'm going to ask you if you want to add a few more comments to Tim's comments. Okay. Can you just unmute your mic, please, Kate?
All right, thank you. Yeah, there's a couple of points I wanted to ask about economics. First, I hear people talking a lot of the past panels about the cost per megawatt. And I just wanted to make the point that megawatts are like a flow rate. And so it does matter that it's not available, that some technologies are not available all the time. So as Paul said, you can't really compare apples to apples. And so time of day also matters when you're looking at prices. And if some technologies can only sell during the middle of the day, when sometimes in some markets these prices can go negative, then it does matter that geothermal can produce power at other times of the day, when in the evenings, when the wind's not blowing, when the sun's not shining, and those prices then are higher during those parts of the day. So it's important to keep those two pieces in mind when you're looking at economics and comparing the price of geothermal with the price of other technologies. The other thing that matters is scale, and I know that those in oil and gas know this. When you start to drill hundreds or thousands of wells, the price per well starts to go down significantly from a manufacturing standpoint. But one other comment that came up was that we also need to be looking at things from the power plant side. And NREL's also done research in this area. We've got a paper out that shows that as geothermal scales and as we start putting more and more of these power plants online, that these two can come down in price from $1 million a megawatt to hundreds of thousands of dollars a megawatt. And that starts to make a difference as well. So all of this really plays into the economics.
Great, thanks, Kate. And Monica, I'm going to throw to you in a second. We're talking about PPAs, power purchase agreements, and you have some real insights there for us around how competitive is geothermal compared to other generation types? So, Monica.
Yeah, I mean, I think Paul and Katie kind of summarized exactly what the processes that we went through in selecting geothermal. But just to kind of back up, when we issue our solicitations for renewable resources to meet our renewable portfolio standard and clean energy requirements, we get tons of proposals. Our solicitation that we issued in 2019 generated over 150 different offers, very few from geothermal, maybe just 3 or 4 out of a whole bunch, mostly coming from solar and solar plus storage. So when you look at all those proposals and you do your ranking and you do your evaluation based on just PPA costs, geothermal quickly falls to the bottom, because obviously we all know that the PPA cost for geothermal is much higher than it is for solar and solar plus storage, and even wind for that matter. But then we go into a kind of a calculation on what are the net benefits. And so to Paul's point, we look at all the attributes. And in California, reliability is a really important thing. And the ability for a resource to produce what we call resource adequacy is super important. And more that cost of resource adequacy in California is becoming bigger and bigger, especially as we phase out some natural gas resources and once through cooling units in California, it's become a scarce resource. And in PG&E service territory, or where my CCA operates, the big facility that provides a huge source of baseload generation, of clean baseload generation in California, the Diablo Canyon Nuclear Power Facility, is scheduled to go offline in 2025. So this is really important to the regulators in California, to the California Independent System Operator. They see a huge capacity shortfall looming in the future. So they are encouraging the development of more baseload clean energy resources such as geothermal. That said, it's really hard for a small CCA like us or any other load serving entity that doesn't have a whole lot of balance sheet or ability to take big projects or big risk to enter into these geothermal contracts when they're seeing such a high price relative to solar and solar plus storage. So for us, we really had to make the case, and not just the case on what the net benefit would be in the short term, but also what the net benefit would be long term, the strategic value of entering into these contracts to be able to meet our reliability requirements, to support the grid, and then also importantly, to help us transition to a real carbon-free grid. So, you know, we are a carbon-free CCA, and I say that with air quotes because we measure our carbon freeness on an annual basis. And so if you all have seen what happens in California and curtailments in the duck curve, you all know that even though we have a lot of renewables on the grids, there are times, lots of hours in the day where we are relying on natural gas. And so for Silicon Valley Clean Energy, we want to move to a model where we have more hours with clean energy than not. And that helps us support our other objectives that we have at Silicon Valley Clean Energy, which is to electrify, to move some of our end uses such as water heating, cooking, and transportation to use electricity. And we can only really do that if our real source of energy on the grid is cleaner than what it is today.
Thanks, Monica. And Tim, I'm going to invite you to say a few more words.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to build on a couple points Monica made. And first off, I think it's fantastic that even from the organization that you're in, that you were able to do that work and prove out the benefits, because it's always so hard to do something for the first time. But once you prove that template for others and make that argument and really do the studies on the net benefits, you really break the mold and make it easier for others. And I wanted to key on a couple of things here. One is you highlighted the retirement of Diablo Canyon. That's a lot of clean energy that produces in the nighttime in the winter that's going away in 2025. And in California so far, the story of decarbonization has really been about getting cleaner and cleaner daytime hours, whereas we haven't moved the needle at all on nighttime hours. And in fact, we're going to move in the opposite direction when Diablo Canyon gets retired. And I want to talk a little bit about why that's a problem. You know, one of the things that California has done tremendously last year in response to the SB 100 regulation is the California Energy Commission has created an interagency working group on how to actually achieve those goals and get to decarbonization. And on our side in geothermal, we talk about supply a lot, but we're not the only, supply is not the only thing that's changing in this market. And I want hours that's impacted by that electrification that Monica highlighted. If you think about the big goals on the electrification side of decarbonizing heating and transportation, that means way more electric vehicles on the grid and way more heat pumps and electric heating sources on the grid. And I was fortunate enough to be invited to talk at the California Energy Commission workshop on SB 100 goals. And they're really, as far as I know, the only regulatory body or agency in the world that's looking at decarbonization, both from supply and demand at the same time. And I'll tell you something that's shocking is right now, people often think about meeting peak demand as a summer or sundown problem. But if we're successful in California in decarbonizing the heating load and adding electric vehicles to the grid, the peak hours for energy consumption are actually going to be in January or February at 4 in the morning when it's really cold out and we're relying on a lot of electric heat. So not only are you seeing these net benefits being recognized by the marketplace, you're going to see night and winter clean energy resources retired in California in this coming decade, while at the same time the load growth for night and winter is going to be growing tremendously. And so our ability to decarbonize California, and California is really a leader in the world, comes down to, can we get cost effectively night and winter electricity decarbonized? Because if we can't, then all of the efforts into electric vehicles and building decarbonization are a moot point, because if we're just burning more natural gas to get that, we're not really in the needle any. And so not only are these net benefits being recognized, but this decade is going to see a lot of developments on the supply and the demand side that's just going to make that even more important.
So Monica, I might just throw back to you there. Tim made some comments about geothermal and its role in decarbonisation of industry. So emissions from geothermal projects we know are relatively small for both direct use and electricity generation, especially when we compare them to fossil fuels. So is this recognised by policymakers? And if not, how can we emphasise this more to them?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. You know, at Silicon Valley Clean Energy, again, we are a carbon-free agency. And when I first started at Silicon Valley Clean Energy, there was definitely a sense that geothermal was bad. Like geothermal has emissions associated with it, whether they're anthropogenic or not, and that's bad. And therefore we can't actually consider geothermal regardless of costs or benefits. We shouldn't even look at it because it just doesn't fit with our model. And even if you look at it from the perspective of how you have to report emissions, it's really confusing. So we report our emissions on a voluntary basis through the Climate Registry's Electric Power Sector Protocol, and the emissions reportable on there are very minimal. You know, you have to report emissions associated with conventional geothermal, that is the anthropogenic emissions, but they're small relative to natural gas, but nonetheless they're not zero, and so that makes it hard to claim you're carbon-free if they're not zero. And then the TCR actually allows us to be unit specific. So if we have a facility that doesn't produce emissions like a binary geothermal resource, then we get to claim zero. That said, in California, we're subject to a whole different set of rules around what we report and don't report. And through legislation, we have a new set of standards on our power content reporting label. And unfortunately, the standards associated with how we report emissions on that haven't caught up with the technology or the reality. And so we will likely have to report emissions for both conventional and binary geothermal on those resources as well. So that all kind of was important to our board of directors when they considered geothermal. But at the end of the day, what we were able to convince them is even if we have to report these small emissions, it still is better than looking at it from kind of, again, the situation where the grid necessarily isn't clean on every hour. So we showed them that if we looked at every hour of the day and calculated the emissions of adding solar plus storage versus wind versus geothermal on an hourly basis, not accounting for surpluses, just looking at it on an hourly basis, we actually reduce our emissions with geothermal because it's on for so many more hours. And so with that, and then with the promise of also looking at a way to neutralize the small emissions associated with the facilities that we will bring online, including looking at offsets or a different procurement strategy, that cost of doing that was minimal relative to the overall objective of trying to, again, decarbonize our grid, or the sector of our grid that we're responsible for.
Thanks, Monica. And before I go to you, Paul, I just want to say to everybody out there listening, we're going to have a few more questions that we're going to ask the panel, and then I'm going to start asking questions from the audience. So please start submitting your questions for the Q&A panel. So, Paul, back to you. You wanted to add some comments from Monica's words?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, the California Air Resources Board, which is probably one of the, if not the world leader in kind of looking at these emissions, has declared closed-loop binary systems as emission-free. And that was a lot of work from the geothermal industry and the Geothermal Energy Association and Resource Council to do that, to get into the weeds with those folks and kind of explain and bring them out to power plants. And I think it's really, an evolution. And I think for those who have turned into Pivot for the last 2 days, you've heard about this kind of closed loop technology, and that's the future, which is going to be zero carbon, like I talked about before. And, the binary technologies allow these technologies to ramp up and ramp down. So building on what Tim said of, when this power is needed, this is becoming, just so exciting for this industry to say, when you need power and it needs to be carbon free in the eyes of CARB, the California Air Resources Board, here's a solution that can ramp up quicker than a natural gas plant and provides, this incredible workforce. And I think part of, this discussion is this pivot from oil and gas. And, we're doing economic impact studies to look at, the amount of jobs created to put this, these kind of projects in motion and so forth. And it's staggering because we have to do all of the geoscience work, the drilling and so forth to bring these plants online. And so it's, it's really exciting to be a part of this and that transition to this zero emission future. And I think, frankly, the future of standalone flash power plants is going away. Those facilities in the future, to be even more efficient, will be adding bottoming cycles. And not to get too technical, but basically for those listening who understand how a combined cycle natural gas plant works, it's the exact same in the geothermal sector. If we have high intensity steam, we will use that to spin a turbine and produce power. We will then let that steam condense, which is hot, and run it into a bottoming cycle or a binary unit. And we are squeezing every bit of efficiency out of our geothermal facilities. So, for those who think of old flash facilities as the geothermal and it hasn't changed in 50 years, I hope that these panels change people's opinion of that, because you're hearing about these new technologies and these facilities are becoming as efficient as, combined cycle natural gas plants today. They can behave, in the same way, but have that zero emission protocol from the California Air Resources Board, which is just critical.
Great, thanks, Paul. And I think, adding on to that, direct use, industrial direct use projects are really huge opportunities to decarbonise our industrial processing activity that's going on around the world, and offer really significant economic development opportunities with respect to jobs. So there's some great examples around New Zealand and the world around how small communities are benefiting from large significant job numbers when we marry up direct use geothermal with electricity projects in locations. Caitlin, I'm just going to head over to you to add some final comments before we go to the question and answers from the audience. Can you unmute, please, Caitlin?
Thank you. I was just going to add to that. You mentioned oil and gas, and from that perspective as well, just again taking an example, this is using geothermal instead of, for example, plugging and abandoning a well. That's an excellent example of getting a longer return on investment for the original well drilled. Of course, there are a few limitations, right? It has to be where the bottom hole temperatures are high enough, and the dimensional configuration of the existing well has to be big enough to put in a closed loop system. But I think as we're thinking from a perspective of an E&P company, an exploration and production company in the oil and gas sector, and thinking about, okay, what are the climate related risks and opportunities to our business, and how can we access these new types of financing out there for transition. I'll give you a few examples in a second. Using geothermal to repurpose existing wells where where it works could be a really exciting and interesting way for oil and gas exploration and production companies to extend the return on those existing wells drilled, as well as to access additional financing. And so a couple of examples is that, of course, folks have probably heard of green bonds, but there's all kinds of new flavors of green bonds out there. Energy transition bonds. So actually getting financing for projects for your company to invest in the technologies needed to essentially participate in the energy transition, right? There's financing out there for that. So there are also sustainable development bonds now focused on the impact areas of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So there's all kinds of really interesting things happening in the ESG investing and impact financing world that I think can really be brought to bear to bring geothermal into the energy mix, and particularly for some of these traditional companies. Like oil and gas exploration and production companies, thinking about how to repurpose that, not only the existing wellbore, but the existing talent and engineering prowess that this industry has to help promote a transition to a low carbon economy. So I'll leave it at that.
Great, thanks, Caitlin. And Kate, you wanted to add some more commentary around the jobs side of things with geothermal projects.
Yeah, Andy, you had mentioned about the jobs in geothermal, and I wanted to elaborate on that a little bit. And just to highlight that, we do have concerns now with unemployment rates, with the oil and gas industry, and with the shutting of coal plants and things. And I just wanted to highlight that geothermal really does bring more jobs than any other renewable out there, and part of that is in this development, not only with the geologists and the drilling and the engineers, as Caitlin highlighted, but also from the power plant side. So when we see the shuttering of these coal power plants, those skills, power plant operation skills, are directly translatable to the geothermal industry. And these are long-term wage earning jobs, not temporary transient jobs. And so I think that that's an important benefit to geothermal.
Great, thanks, Kate. I'm going to ask Tim to add a few more comments, and then I'll throw to Doug to add the final comments before we move to the audience questions. So Tim.
Yeah, I want to talk about jobs. I'm from Texas, worked in Houston in the oil and gas industry for many years. The first thing that Fervo did when we closed our Series A and realized we could hire more was open a Houston office, and our main engineering and operations office is in Houston, and it's specifically because of all the talented people in the oil and gas workforce. And there's tremendous opportunity for crossover. And just to do a plug, hopefully I'm doing this right for the conference organizers, tune in Friday at 10 a.m. for an entire session on the career crossover from oil and gas to geothermal. But I just want to tie this back to the policy question because it's all related. The rig count right now in the U.S. is the lowest it's ever been. They've tracked it for 50 years. There's fewer drilling rigs in operation than there ever have been. The layoffs, I get called by former colleagues day after day asking if there's jobs, and we're hiring, and I'm excited about that. There's many people that we've provided a career transition for already, and we're going to continue to do so. But our ability to do that and do it with a speed that makes a difference for these people that have been laid off is really difficult. And one of the answers I have for people is we have sites ready to go. We've got drilling plans ready to go, but some of the regulatory applications I have for these have been pending review for 13 months now. And if I want to get people to work, that's unacceptable. We need to put people to work now. And so a lot of this depends on getting the right resources for policy. And I just want to tie it back to we as an industry are ready to go. We have the sites, we have the know-how. We want to hire oil and gas people because they're brilliant, they're talented, they know how to deliver wells. But the thing that's tripping us most right now is months or years long reviews on things that if I was doing an oil and gas project would be turned around in a couple of weeks. And we've got to fix that if we actually want to do this for people.
Thank you, Tim. And Doug, I'll leave it over to you for the final comment.
Okay, thanks, Andy. One thing that's coming that also comes out of this conversation, and I think Paul did a great job of bringing it up, is that geothermal is increasingly more than just what we would call sort of traditional geothermal. So the opportunity and the scale for geothermal is more than just Nevada and California and a few other Western states. It's, if you look at both the traditional direct use, enhanced geothermal systems, the kind of work that Tim's doing some work in, closed loop systems in oil and gas wells, you're talking about a much greater part of the country that's actually is going to have the opportunity to see geothermal, to see the benefits of geothermal, not just in a grid sense, but also in a community sense. And I sort of joke about this and say, one of the goals is to have geothermal in more congressional districts. But it's really important to have a broader footprint because that also then underpins that opportunity of actually going to scale. Kate's point earlier of really getting to sort of the manufacturing scale that we've seen oil and gas do in shale wells, and the same opportunity sits out there for this full suite of geothermal technologies.
Great, thanks, Doug. So let's now move into questions from our audience. Paul, I think you're going to be the right person for this one. From Bill Leahy, what help should we request from the US Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee while Senator Murkowski is still the chair? And how about legislative support in Canada, Africa, Europe, and the rest of the world? Feel free to pick whichever part of that you would like to answer. And then anyone else who'd like to chime in, please do so.
So I think I'll just focus briefly on the United States and try to be quick so we can get through questions. Having Senator Murkowski as chair of the Energy Committee has been phenomenal. There have been geothermal efforts and geothermal resources in Alaska. She conducted a hearing in 2019, I think, which was the first hearing dedicated to geothermal in over a decade, and is actively addressing the permitting issues that you've heard discussed here. The categorical exclusion is in her omnibus energy bill that is being held up in Congress at the moment with discussions of lower carbon resources unrelated to us in any way. And I would encourage everyone on this call to, as you've heard today, let your legislators know that if we can expedite geothermal development, we can put people to work. Even in this pandemic, we are a critical resource. ORMAT has been proud to bring online a geothermal project during all of this. We can put people out to work in rural areas and keep them safe. And so I would encourage everyone to reach out to your legislators to do that. We have made progress. It's on the menu. We've also had legislation introduced by our congressman from Nevada, Congressman Horsford, and it's very exciting, I think, for all of you to note that part of the entire House of Representatives climate change focus highlights geothermal and the role it can play because we offset so much additional generation, and that's that 4-to-1 ratio. So things are moving in the right direction. Please reach out. And then the shameless plug here is that the Geothermal Resource Council has a policy committee, and the more of you that join that, we will keep you abreast of all that is going on with those issues and give you the tools, as Doug pointed out, to we have preformed letters and things that you can send to your legislators to get the message out.
Thanks, Paul. And I think the message is clear there. And for lots of the regulatory discussion we had earlier is join us and help us push. So on to another question here from Paul Hardman. I hear a lot from the presenters to date on the geothermal positives and the impacts it can have. So how do you demonstrate to the wider world that the risks can be mitigated and the economics made sound, cost per kilowatt? And Kate, I think that I'm going to throw to you first and then see if anyone else wants to add comments.
Sure. So the risks come in the upfront exploration, and they come in the long timelines, these long regulatory timelines that people are talking about. NREL does not take a position on policy as a federally funded research and development facility, but our analyses do show that these do have an impact and they do increase risk. And you've heard from both Paul and Tim the effects that has in the field. From the exploration standpoint, there's a couple of things. Certainly, the methods are improving. As Doug Hollett mentioned earlier today, one of the things that he put in place when he was with the Geothermal Technologies Office is taking oil and gas techniques like play fairway analyses and applying them to geothermal. A lot of the work that the Geothermal Technologies Office is doing today is to help better image that subsurface and help better understand what you're drilling into when you're drilling. And that's for traditional hydrothermal systems. And a lot of what some of the panelists have talked about over the past several days are other ways to reduce risk. So how do we shift the paradigm of geothermal and look at ways that we can do geothermal anywhere? Then we're reducing risk. We're not trying to target a single fracture or a set of fracture zones. We're actually able to create this heat exchanger wherever it's needed. And so that's a lot of the work that Tim Latimer and his company at Fervo are doing, and a lot of the other panelists that you've heard on the past couple of sessions on AGS and EGS. And that's really working to reduce this upfront risk.
So there's a few of you that want to add to those comments. Paul, I'm going to go to you, then Doug, then Tim. So Paul.
So, I think the easy answer, and I think Tim alluded to it earlier, is we have power purchase agreements that are publicly available. People can go and see that the cost per kilowatt hour for new state-of-the-art geothermal facilities is between 6 and 7 cents. And that takes a lot of that risk away when you can look at the market that you're, evaluating. And, I put the question back on the questioner to say, does 6 or 7 cent power make a difference to you? And when you compare that, there is so much talk in the marketplace today about storage. And I want people to think, when they think of geothermal, as kind of a form of earth storage. We have the ability to produce power 24 hours a day. We can shift when that power is produced. So when you start looking at comparing this technology to an intermittent renewable resource or adding storage, the economics prove themselves out. And a 6 cent power or 6 to 7 cent power source that's available 24 hours a day, that can be turned on and turned off, which replaces your need for storage or other intermittent resources. As a publicly traded company on the New York Stock Exchange for Ormat, we don't see a risk. We see complete upside for utilities, and I think we are seeing that in the marketplace. And that's the message to get out to folks. And that paradigm has really changed in the last probably 5 years.
Doug, we're going to move to you now to add some comments, and then Tim.
Great, thanks. Thinking a little bit, just following on Kate's comments about risk and upfront costs. What we see is these technologies go from that early R&D stage to testing stage to deployment stage. As these costs come down, the risk of either finding the resource or confirming the resource, that comes down. And the best way, I think, to look at this is to look at these cost and deployment curves that we've seen. Although they're in different sectors, if we look back at solar, we look at wind, and look at where those curves once were and where they've gone. The more direct analogy to geothermal could be looking at the early stages of shale development. And I was in the industry long enough to be listening to folks saying this is the dumbest thing we've ever heard of. We should never be doing this. And wells, for example, in North Dakota, that might take 115 days. And cost $17, $18, $19 million, quickly moved to being, doing 4 times, 5 times the lateral, drilling those wells in 9 days for a third of the cost. So if you look at where these curves go as you test the technologies, improve them, this is the background I come from, this is the background Tim comes from. You can see I think it's a way of communicating where geothermal is going, and make sure that you sort of articulate where those trends are actually getting traction.
Thanks, Doug. We'll move to you, Tim, and then both Monica and Caitlin want to chime in on this as well. So, Tim.
Great, thanks. In the initial question, there was a reference to international, and so I wanted to kind of bring that into the discussion a little bit, and especially as Kate talked about how that a lot of that risk is in the upfront exploration place, and Africa was mentioned, and I want to highlight a place where this is done really, really well, and that's Kenya. And just to give a study of Kenya for people who aren't aware, they went from really one kind of demonstration operating plant a little over a decade ago to a very rapid growth in the geothermal sector, where it's now over half the electricity supply, and coupled with their hydro and wind resources, they almost have a fully decarbonized grid already, which is quite tremendous. And I want to look at some of the policy things they did there that made that happen and really helped address this high upfront exploration piece. So first, they've created a really clear public-private partnership structure, and different state-owned companies, KenGen and the Geothermal Development Company, have ownership and do a lot of work in doing the upfront confirmation studies, confirmation drilling, proving out resources. And additionally, working with the international development community through programs like the Geothermal Risk Mitigation Facility for East Africa, you can get matching funds for that earliest part of the project. You know, a few $100,000 for surface studies, a few $1 million for confirmation drilling. And you bite down the risk of that part of the process, the riskiest part of the process, and you find people in the private sector that are more than happy to come in and partner to take those projects over the finish line. And a few $100,000 or a few $1 million up front has catalyzed hundreds of millions of dollars of private sector investment of groups that come in and partner with the government and take those forward. And then in terms of the framework for selling that power, you know, they have a clear tariff structure that everybody knows right up front what that's going to cost, and you can do your own economics and you can build it. There's not a lot of the ambiguity you have here in the U.S. market. And so you have public support, you've got de-risked facilities, and you've got a clear regulatory framework. And you take that and compare what it takes to get a new resource discovered and developed in the U.S., and it's a night and day difference. You know, we have, as Paul mentioned before, years of regulatory review before we even get to the point where we can do those studies, that kind of confirmation drilling. There's little to no public sector support for projects in that phase of the operation. And so we're sitting over here in this camp where we can't get a few $100,000 or a few $1 million that would be the exact thing that you need to unlock an opportunity for hundreds of millions of dollars of investment for a de-risk project. And these projects just stall out. I can tell you, as somebody who raises money for these projects, who does all these other things, going to an investor and saying, hey, give me money. The regulatory review for this is going to take 5 years. We may or may not have anything there, and we won't know this for another 5 years. That's not a recipe for success. And I think we need to be a lot more creative in the US about how we're incentivizing these things. And we can look to Kenya as a place that has really put in a great framework and work domestically and with the international community to get projects up and running. And if we were to mimic some of those things here in the US, we'd see the same tremendous growth in the sector that they have there.
Great, thanks, Tim. Monica, we're going to head to you and then on to you, Caitlin.
Yeah, so just going, I guess, back down in the trenches from a buyer's perspective in California, we certainly care about risk a lot, and we look at risk from a whole bunch of different aspects. But for us, what's important and we have a focus on is regulatory and policy risk. And operating as a load serving entity in California, we're subject to a whole bunch of regulatory and policy requirements around what we can and cannot buy. And through the CPUC, the California Public Utility Commission, they have a process which is called an integrated resource planning process. And through that process, they essentially identify what the best set of resources would be for California load serving entities to pursue between now and 2030 to get us to the greenhouse gas reductions that they need in an affordable and reliable way, hopefully. And so through that process, they've identified what they call their reference system plan. And that reference system plan does not include new geothermal. And so it was excluded from the integrated resource plan process this time around. And what was heavily included was a whole lot of new solar plus storage and standalone batteries, including long duration battery and out-of-state wind. And so all of those resources introduce a whole new set of risk to Californians and to a low serving entity like ours to buy. So it's important that even though the economics may play well for geothermal and it makes sense for us to do it and we see strategic value, we could still run the risk on a policy standpoint of having to procure resources that aren't necessarily geothermal in order to meet the policy's greater, goals and what they think is important for us to be deploying. So with that said, I think from our perspective, it was really important to diversify technologies. Economics aside, just from a risk management standpoint, we cannot just load up our resources. We have a lot to buy with solar and solar plus storage. It just doesn't make sense. That introduces a whole bunch of risk to our portfolio of having one type of technology, and for the most part, having it all sited in the same location, the Central Valley. So geothermal provided an ability for us to diversify technology and location, and therefore manage some of that risk. And the other thing that we tend to do is we join up with other load serving entities to do procurement. And in that way, we're able to diversify some of the risk associated with development and financing this project. So we don't take that all on ourselves as one entity. That's something that has been very successful for us the last 2-3 solicitations that we've done, and we'll probably be doing it in the future. But anyway, I just wanted to put out there that risk is a really hard one to measure, and our general strategy is just to do a bunch of little things, and hopefully we don't increase concentration risk in technology.
Great, thanks, Kathleen. Good to hear to you. And if we keep it short, we've got a few other questions to get through.
Sure. So I just want to bring up a couple of other types of risks that haven't been discussed too much yet in this particular question. Environmental and social risks, E&S of the ESG. So very similar to oil and gas, I think there's a lot of lessons that geothermal can learn from the history of oil and gas, both good practices and things to avoid. And so, one example from the environmental risk standpoint, and I think this is probably one of the hesitations for a lot of folks that don't understand how new geothermal technologies work, and that is, concerns about water quality and contamination. Anytime you're drilling a well, people in communities are going to be concerned about that. Of course, certain geothermal systems employ hydraulic fracturing, which we know is not always popular in the communities where that takes place. But as an industry, we know there are good practices, best practices for mitigating those risks. The oil and gas industry has a proven track record in best practices for well integrity, process safety, all of those things that mitigate the environmental risks of undertaking these types of technologies. But I think what the oil and gas industry hasn't done as well, and they are collectively the first to admit it, right, is that they did not do a good job historically of communicating their impact and the ways that they mitigated those risks. So from a financial financing standpoint, all of that's incredibly important. But when it comes to social license to operate and getting not only communities but policymakers and sort of the general public on board for geothermal, taking a proactive and strategic approach to stakeholder engagement is really a requirement to obtain and maintain that social license to operate. And conferences like this one this week are, a great example of that and getting the word out and trying to raise awareness. But I think that's another parallel. When we talk about risk, we need to talk about all risks. And environmental and social being the ones that are usually top of mind for communities and often for policymakers as well. So I'll leave it there.
Great, thanks guys. So I have a few of related questions, and if we can keep it short and sharp, we can probably get a couple more in. So these questions come from a few people out there around permitting and around, so first of all, if we can harvest geothermal heat anywhere, say with deep closed loops technologies, can we avoid public lands and their regulations? additional to that, can we retask old oil wells, and what is the permitting around that? So I'm not sure who would like to jump in on that. Okay, we'll go to Kate and Paul. If we could keep it really short answers, there's a couple more questions I'd like to get done before we finish today. So Kate.
Sure. Yeah, and so there is more opportunity to not be on public lands as we spread throughout the U.S. The Western U.S. is 80%, I think, is one of the numbers I heard. 80% public lands, if you look at the state of Nevada particularly, and so it does put a lot of geothermal resources on federal lands. And so I certainly think moving outside of that will help. One of the things that's been very different, though, that I wanted to highlight is that if you drill the exact same well with the exact same equipment to the same depth in the same place, and you check the mining box or the oil and gas box, as Tim said, you can get a permit in a matter of days or weeks. But if you check the geothermal box for the exact same activity with the same equipment, it can take months to years to get that permit. And so that's where the discrepancy lies.
Thanks, Kate. And Paul, we will move to you. You want to add a few comments to that? You're on mute.
From the oil and gas perspective, there have been 2 successful projects of repurposing oil and gas wells for geothermal development. I would encourage folks to look at the Rocky Mountain Oil Test Center, where ORMAT put in a small binary unit on a water break in an oil well and produced additional power from it. This technology has been looked at also by the Southern Methodist University Geothermal Lab. And so I think there's incredible potential there. And from the new R&D we've heard about with smaller closed loop systems, this could be absolutely viable and an exciting development there. This work has been done, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. I would encourage folks to look at SMU, and the Ramatzi project, the Rocky Mountain Oil Test Center, was really interesting as well, because it was the first time that I'm aware of, and having to negotiate that project between the DOE fossil fuel program and the DOE renewable geothermal program. And if you think bureaucracy is tough, try to get 2 siloed DOE programs to work together to buy a geothermal project. It happened. It's all public information, and I would encourage all of you to go look at that and see if we can deploy new technologies in such wells.
Great, thanks, Paul. I think we'll make this the last question, and then we will get the panelists to quickly wrap up their thoughts in 1 minute or less. So manage your awesomeness into 1 minute. Thanks, panelists. Final question here is from Fermin Carrillo. Are there any new efforts on tools or resources to help startups model financial returns or economics on geothermal projects? Is there anyone on the panel who would like to? Kate, okay, we will head to you for the final response, and then we'll go to the wrap-ups. Thank you. Sure.
Yeah, NREL has developed a lot of tools that are freely available on our website through funding through the Geothermal Technologies Office at the Department of Energy. And so there's tools like GET'em, the Geothermal Electricity Technology Evaluation Model, and GeoFires that can look at techno-economics of a project. There's tools like JEDI that can look at jobs and economic impact of your project, so you can communicate with the local communities. There's different tools out there that the Geothermal Prospector, where you can look at different layers and data sets. You can look at the potential permitting under the Regulatory and Permitting Information Desktop or Rapid Toolkit. So if you have any questions or need any access to any of these free tools, please feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to point you to them and show you how they work.
Great, thanks, Kate. And now we will move to our final remarks. Who can believe we're at the end? How do we get there so quickly? So I'm going to throw to you in the order that you introduced yourselves. So we'll start with you, Kate. Your final remarks, thanks.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to reiterate the point that when you're looking at project economics, there's a lot of different factors that go into economics. It's not just comparing megawatt to megawatt, price per megawatt to price per megawatt. There's a whole lot of other considerations. And to think about looking at scale, when this scales, what does this look like? And just that we as a community need to come together to address the regulatory issue, to be able to be on par with other technologies that are out there.
Thanks, Kate. And now, Paul, you'll be up next. And go.
So, I think it's such an exciting time, and as we see more projects and more PPAs being signed, we need to drill more projects. And I think, I want to harp on the fact that we need to use the expertise in the oil and gas industry. I think we heard that Fervo is hiring, so is Ormat and other companies looking to expand that. And the drilling that we have done has always been, competing against that of the oil and gas industry. And as that competition wanes, we want to do more. And so I would encourage folks, whether you're a drilling company looking to do additional work, can we outsource those projects and so forth? We want to do that. And I think from a climate change perspective, our former chairman used to always say, if it was easy, everybody would do it. And so in geothermal, we've always kind of said, we can do it, we will do it. And I think for climate change and for all of us, we must do it. And so we will continue to work hard on this. And, for anybody who couldn't get to their questions and so forth, don't hesitate to reach out to us. I think this industry is small. We're all open to taking emails and questions. Would love to follow up with anybody watching from around the world on what can be done. And I think in the next decade, we're going to show, that the U.S. reassert itself in developing this resource like it did in the early 80s, with the thousands of megawatts brought on by the geysers projects and so forth. And on the next panel, we can discuss international projects in Africa and Indonesia and New Zealand, your home country, and all the fantastic things that are going on there as well. So thank you for having me, and I look forward to following up with any of the viewers.
Great, thanks, Paul. Tim, moving on to you.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks for putting together this panel, and I think we've highlighted that there's a lot of monumental challenges and making geothermal really a broad scale true resource. But I get so encouraged by things like this because this monumental challenge is met by monumental opportunities and tools, and it's incredible to me. One of the things I found most refreshing about working in the geothermal industry is at the end of the day, everyone wants you to win, which is really nice. And I can't give a stronger endorsement for all the tools that Kate just mentioned, from Geothermal Prospector to GetEm to the Rapid Toolkit. I mean, it's really kind of a geothermal startup in a box that they've built, which is really nice to get up and running. And they're not the only ones. I mean, customers like Monica fighting the battle to show the value of geothermal, policymakers going out of their way because they recognize if we do what was laid out in the GeoVision study, in some scenarios, bringing 120 gigawatts of new geothermal online, that's enough electricity that we can pair it with wind and solar and batteries and get to a completely clean grid. And that's the future we're all going for. And I think what's most exciting is organizations like Texas Geo and NREL and the whole ecosystem is really meeting these challenges with the right people and the right skill set to succeed. And we're going to win. And this is going to be the decade for geothermal.
Great, thanks, Tim. We're going to move on to Doug, then Caitlin, then Monica. Doug.
Great, thanks, Andy. I'm sort of wired as an optimist from a variety of perspectives, and so if I look at this variety of topics we're talking about, decreased timelines, lowered costs, more effective technologies, you're talking about an economic story for geothermal in all its various forms that continues to improve. And the reason that this, to me, is really exciting is you start moving into sort of that financial or economic target bandwidth that a lot of other entities, financial and operating entities, are going to start looking at geothermal and say, we want to be part of this. And I think Tim, as an example, he's seeing this, others are seeing this, and so to me this is sort of a fun scenario that what does geothermal start to look like when all these new players look at it and say, this meets my target for rate of return, or this meets my target for net income on an annual basis for a major oil company. That's a game-changing scenario, and we're moving in that direction really, really fast.
Great, thanks, Doug. And Caitlin, we are moving on to you.
Thank you. No, thank you for having me. It's really been such an awesome conversation. I think what I'll leave with is thinking about something that Monica brought up originally, and that is how reporting, voluntary reporting of emissions can drive decisions in one way or another, and the importance of getting that reporting piece right. That's something that we work on and look at and trying to get it right for our clients. But it's kind of a big, messy landscape. And I think we need to make sure that when we're looking at all these technologies side by side, that we're looking at the full cycle of impact materials from cradle to grave. And certainly part of the messaging for geothermal as well is the not having a need for storage and all of the mining and that comes out of the ground to make the materials for batteries and storage. I mean, I think there's just such a bigger picture there when you look at the full life cycle of any particular form of energy. But that said, it's not a zero-sum game. As we know, we need all solutions on the table to get us to carbon neutral. Keep up the good work, everyone, and feel free to contact us if you have questions about ESG and finance and all of that stuff. So thank you.
Great, thanks. Thank you, Caitlin. And Monica, last but not least.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for having me. It's been a pleasure to be on this panel. I just would close with saying, in California, we're certainly leading the way in terms of combating climate with our very aggressive policies to reduce emissions, including trying to get to carbon neutrality by 2045. And to get there, we're going to have to employ a whole bunch of different solutions to ensure that we do it in an affordable and reliable and clean way. And I think geothermal certainly has a role there. And since most of us buyers are doing the buying now and maybe can't see the long-term strategic value or see the value in being able to shift our grid to a cleaner grid and support all electrification and decarbonization initiatives that we want to undertake, I just leave it to you to promote those values better. To when you submit your proposals, whether it's a 7 megawatt geothermal facility or 300 megawatt geothermal, that you really promote the reliability and the ability to get us to that clean grid that we so want to get to. And because that's not our job necessarily to find those benefits, but it's certainly your job to promote them as best you can.
Great, thanks, Monica. And we are running a couple of minutes late, but it's all right. I got permission to have a couple of extra minutes because obviously the conversation was so interesting. Thanks to the panel, all of you, for turning up and giving your time. There were some great comments in there. I'm pretty sure the audience enjoyed some insights. And as you all in the audience can see, us geothermal people are very passionate about geothermal. It's a great community of optimists, of smart people who enjoy complex challenges. And I think the messaging here is we want you to join us, and we're hiring and we need your skills. So I mirror Paul's comments about connecting with us through LinkedIn or other ways, and keep asking the questions. I look forward to seeing you all at geothermal conferences. And thank you very much for your time. We've fully enjoyed talking about what we love. And please make sure you join the rest of the Pivot events. There's another one happening in T-minus 20 minutes, 11:45 Central Time US, on the future of drilling. So thanks very much, everybody. Take care out there, and see you all again. Thanks very much.
Thank you.